Hello and welcome back to Programming for Biologists. Today we're going to be just going over a couple of the basics that we need to understand before we get into too much coding. We're going to have a quick look at Visual Studio Code again, and also look at the difference between Python scripts and Python notebooks. So if we go back into Visual Studio Code, if you open it up again, you'll probably see this welcome page. And at the side, you have the Explorer, like we said before. And at the top, this lets you select a folder. And in that folder, you can view all of the scripts that are in that folder and subfolders. So I'm going to quickly go open for this. And then open up my folder that I created to store all my files for this course. And there are no files yet because I will be programming along with you. So when we're programming in Python, there are basically two types of files that you need to know about. The first one is just Python scripts. Now, if this is your first time opening Visual Studio Code, you probably won't have this Python option, but not to worry. So you can just click text file and then select a language, type Python. And this knows that this is going to be a Python file now. And if you remember last time, we installed all of the associated packages to do with Python inside Visual Studio Code. So if you haven't done that, check the first video. But this basically means that Python will start to predict, well, Visual Studio Code will start to predict what we want to type in Python. Now, there are different functions that we can use inside of Python. One that I tend to use a lot is print, and I use this just to check the value of something, what something is, to look at a table or whatever. You don't always have to do this depending on the type of Python file that you're using, but for standard Python scripts, print is super useful. So this is just going to be a standard Python script, and I'm just going to type print and a bunch of numbers. And then I'm going to click run. And because I haven't saved this, it's going to ask me to save. So I'm just going to call this lesson 1, part 1. I guess this is actually technically lesson 2. So let's call this lesson 2 then. You don't have to make this script. It's just going to illustrate some of the key points around Python coding. So you'll notice that when we've run this, I'll run it again, but it runs down here in this terminal. And Python scripts will always run in this terminal type system. So you can open up a terminal on your computer if you have a Mac, and if you type Python, then you could type the name of a Python script. For example, if you have the full path to like this Python script, and then if I click enter, it's going to run 1, 2, 3, which is what we had inside this script. And quite often when I'm working with Python scripts, I will have one terminal window open for running my scripts, and then one window open for editing my code. But this only tends to be if I'm using Python scripts. So I keep saying there's these different types of files. So this first one is just Python scripts. You can tell a Python script is a Python script because it's just a .py file, which stands for Python. And when you run anything in a Python script, it's going to run in order. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the lines in the code. You can see that it always prints 1 first, 2, and then 3. Doesn't matter what we put in here inside the print statement. It's going to print this to the terminal when we run it. So it's printing hello, 2, 3. And it's always going to run in this order. And the good thing about Python scripts is they always run in this order. And if you're doing big projects where you're going to basically process the same type of data over and over again, I would recommend just writing Python scripts, because you can just run them on a file and it will do the same thing every single time. Now, the other type of files that are quite popular were actually popularized by Jupyter Notebooks. So when we installed Anaconda, we also installed Jupyter. So I'm just going to launch Jupyter. You don't need to launch Jupyter because we can actually run these inside of Visual Studio Code. So you can see that this has access to our files, and it's just a way of basically running and creating Jupyter scripts through a web browser. So we can create a new notebook. So the difference between normal Python scripts and notebooks is basically your code is broken up into these tiny little chunks, basically. And each of these little cells can be run independently of each other. So like we can run this one cell, right? And then we can run this cell. And you'll also notice that I haven't actually had to save this file. This is an untitled file. It's not saved, but I'm still able to run the code. But I can run the chunks of code out of order. So I've also created this code here, print3, but I can just keep running print hello, print2. I don't have to run print3. I can change this to print7. I can run this, and this is still 2. And this is fine for basically troubleshooting or developing code, because the nice thing about this is it keeps anything that you've created in these chunks run, and it keeps them in memory. And say we'd created some special code up here, we will always be able to access it no matter where we run our code from in any of these other cells. But this does mean that you can basically run sections of your code out of order, which can create problems because, like I say, you might change something up here and you might have some other part of the code that depends on that. But if you haven't run this, the code later will still be using old values even though you've changed them, whereas a normal Python script has to run every single piece of your code in order. Now, the other thing you'll notice is, as I'm typing in Jupyter, it's not predicting anything about what I'm doing. Now, it can do this. If you press tab, it will bring up the options of potential built-in functions that you might want to use. But I don't find this Jupyter interface particularly nice to use or fun to use, and I'm quite lazy. I like to see what my functions are doing and how I'm using them. Like if we type print in here, it gives us the entire documentation about how print works and what to put where and what your expected output might be, right? And we're not getting that in Jupyter. Fortunately, we could create we can open these ipy notebooks in here. So this is that untitled ipy notebook that Jupyter created. You can just rename it. And you'll see that this file type is ipynb, which is ipynotebook. And this is the file type that Jupyter uses, but you can also use it inside of Visual Studio Code. Now, if this is your first time running a Jupyter notebook, in Visual Studio Code, so if I create a new one, will this let me do this? 1 second. Okay, so if you run ipy notebook for the first time, so because this other one was created in Jupyter, it sort of knew what to do with it because it was built in Jupyter, and actually the Jupyter kernel was running in the background. So it will probably bring up this little window. So if you want to work in notebooks, then you should click install, and this will install the the different extensions that Visual Studio Code needs to be able to basically run natively the notebooks. And then it's going to say select kernel. Now, if you've accidentally clicked off this, you can also click over here and click select kernel. And you can basically just click this base one, which will show up if you've installed Anaconda. So you should just select the version of Python that you've installed. Okay. Now, the other cool thing about notebooks is that you don't just have to write code. So we can create these cells full of code, but we can also create Markdown, and we can create headers inside our Markdown. So we could say this is a heading because we've added this hash. And I think if you do 2 hashes, this is a small heading. And then this is just text. And then if you click this tick box, so you have heading, small heading, and then text. So what these cells that are just called Markdown do is allow you to write text around your code. So you could create code that, code that makes a graph. So what I'm doing here is any line that starts with a hash is a comment. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next lesson. But the purpose of this video is basically just to show you the difference between Python scripts and Python notebooks. Now, if you were just to type normally in here, it's just going to start creating loads of errors, because if you go to run this, it thinks that you're trying to create some or run some function that's called, I mean, maybe I should have run something human pronounceable, but you can't just write normal text inside of code. And the powerful thing about notebooks is it does let you sort of write text. So you could write about your results inside your Python file, right? So this is why lots of people like using them for data analysis, because you can basically write your conclusions inside of your script. And then you can also share these with people and they can see what code you run and then what your thoughts about that code was, for example. And the way to add new chunks, basically, let me just delete this. To add these new cells is just to basically either add a code cell or a Markdown cell. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to talk about in this second lesson, is just the different types of Python scripts, where we have .py, which is just a Python script. So everything in this is just going to run in the order that we write it. And then also notebooks, which they are becoming more common and people like them because you can just troubleshoot things. You can keep stuff loaded and you can keep trying again without having to run your entire script. But if you want reproducible code, then you probably more likely want to use Python scripts. For the purposes of the next few videos, I'm probably going to stick inside of these notebooks because it means that we can run little bits of code individually, and it also means that I can break the videos down into sections which are contained within these cells. Okay, so yep, that's the difference between Python scripts and Python notebooks. And in the next video, we will look at variables and different data types inside of Python. Okay, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, then you can like and subscribe. If you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments below and I will try to respond to every single one. Thanks.